cowboy accepted an Apache slave, not knowing she was the chief's daughter from the tribe he wronged. His sun hung low in the sky, painting the dusty plains with shades of gold and orange. Jedediah Jed Walker rode slowly across the open land, his horse's hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that drifted in the warm wind. He had been riding for hours, leaving behind the small town where he had recently sold a few hides and bought supplies. The plains were quiet, almost too quiet, but that had become normal for Jed. Since the death of his wife years ago, he had grown accustomed to solitude, finding a strange comfort in the endless horizon where the sky met the earth in a perfect unbroken line. Jed was a man of simple needs. He didn't care for wealth or fancy clothes. His life had been shaped by hard work, by sunburned skin and calloused hands, by the endless grind of surviving on the frontier. His small homestead, a rough wooden cabin surrounded by a few acres of farmed land, was modest but enough to keep him going. He lived alone, his only companions being his horse, a few chickens, and the quiet that stretched across the plains. Yet, even in this solitude, Jed sometimes felt a restlessness he couldn't name. It was a feeling that made him ride further each day, as if the land itself was calling him towards something he didn't yet understand. On this particular evening, as Jed guided his horse along a narrow trail by the river, he noticed something unusual. There, near the water's edge, lay a small figure. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of rags left by travelers, or perhaps an injured animal. But as he drew closer, his sharp eyes caught movement. It was a young girl, barely more than a child, lying on the ground. Her clothes were torn, and her dark hair was tangled and matted with dirt. She seemed exhausted, almost lifeless. Yet her chest rose and fell with faint, shallow breaths. Jed's instincts kicked in immediately. He dismounted, leaving the reins with his horse, and knelt beside her. "Hey there, you all right?" he asked gently, trying not to startle her. The girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing a pair of deep, dark eyes that seemed far older than her years. Fear and mistrust shone in them, and she recoiled slightly at his touch. Jed noticed the bruises along her arms and the marks around her wrists, bound with what looked like rough rope. Jed's heart tightened. He had seen suffering before, though not often in someone so young. He knew the harshness of frontier life, but this was something else, something cruel. Without hesitation, he carefully freed her from the bindings, keeping his movements slow and calm. The girl flinched at every touch, but eventually she allowed him to remove the ropes. I won't hurt you," Jed said softly, trying to offer comfort through words alone. She didn't respond, only staring at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Jed didn't press. Instead, he lifted her gently, supporting her weight as he carried her to his horse. She was surprisingly light for her age, almost like a bird in his arms. He placed her across the horse's back, taking care not to jostle her. "Hang on," he said. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The ride back to his homestead was slow. The girl didn't speak, didn't even look around. She seemed to shrink into herself, as though every movement, every sound, was a threat. Jed didn't force conversation. He knew better than that. Trust was earned, not demanded. When they reached the cabin, Jed set the girl down on a blanket he spread on the floor. He gave her some water and a small portion of bread, which she accepted reluctantly, nibbling at it while keeping her eyes on him. Jed watched quietly, giving her space. He wanted her to know she was safe, but he also knew that trust could not be rushed. Night fell, and the wind whispered through the cracks of the cabin. Jed built a small fire, its warm light casting shadows that danced along the walls. The girl huddled near the fire, still hesitant but beginning to show signs of relief. Jed sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? Who had done this to her? He thought back to the stories he had heard of the Apache tribes and the conflicts that had sometimes erupted between settlers and native people. But he didn't jump to conclusions. Right now, the most important thing was her safety. Over the next few days, Jed cared for the girl with patient attention. He gave her fresh clothes he had on hand and tended to the small cuts and bruises on her arms and legs. She still wouldn't speak much, only offering nods or shakes of her head in response to his questions. Jed decided to call her Nokomis, a name he had once heard in stories about native women known for their courage and wisdom. Somehow it seemed to suit her. As time passed, small routines began to form. Nokomis learned to help around the cabin, fetching water, feeding the chickens, and even helping Jed with minor repairs. She watched him silently as he worked, her dark eyes observant, taking in every movement, every sound. Jed noticed her intelligence and her resilience. Despite all she had been through, she adapted quickly, learning not just the chores but also the unspoken rules of the world he lived in. Jed, too, found himself changing. He had spent years in solitude, but now, with Nokomis around, he felt a strange warmth he hadn't experienced since his wife had passed. He caught himself talking aloud, telling her stories about the plains, about his travels, about the few adventures he had experienced. She listened quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering a small smile, and though she rarely spoke, her presence filled a void Jed hadn't realized existed. Jed didn't know her full story, and he respected that. He never forced her to talk about the past, though. Sometimes he caught glimpses of it in her eyes. Moments of fear, moments of sadness, moments of longing. He wondered silently what horrors she had witnessed, what loss she had endured. But he also saw something else, a spark of determination, a quiet strength that would not be broken. Despite the calm he tried to maintain, Jed knew that danger was never far away. The frontier was a harsh place, and strangers could arrive at any time with ill intentions. He kept his rifle close, always alert, and taught Nokomis the importance of caution, of being aware of the land and its sounds. She learned quickly, her sharp eyes noticing even the slightest movement among the trees, her ears catching the faintest rustle in the wind. Life on the homestead continued in this quiet rhythm. Days were filled with chores, lessons, and small victories. Nokomis began to speak a few words here and there, mostly answering Jed's questions or commenting on the work they were doing. Her trust in him grew slowly, and Jed in turn grew more protective, more attached. He often thought about the world beyond the plains and how cruel it could be. Yet he also realized that kindness, patience, and care could create a small island of safety even in the harshest of places. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant shades of red and purple, Jed and Nokomis sat outside the cabin. The air was cool, and the stars began to appear one by one, twinkling like tiny lanterns in the vast darkness. Nokomis leaned against him slightly, her head resting on his shoulder. Jed didn't move. He understood that trust could be fragile, and he wanted her to feel in control, to know that she was safe with him. "I don't know your story," Jed said quietly, not expecting an answer, "but you're safe here. As long as I live, you'll be safe." Nokomis didn't speak, but she squeezed his hand slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Jed felt a weight lift from his chest. Perhaps, he thought, this was the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for both of them. The nights passed, each one bringing them closer together in a silent understanding. Nokomis began to smile more often, her laughter quiet but genuine, ringing like a bell across the plains. Jed found himself looking forward to her small jokes, her observations, her quiet companionship. The homestead, once a lonely refuge, had become a place of life, of connection, of hope. Jed didn't yet know the full truth about Nokomis, her past, her identity, the tribe she had come from, but he knew one thing. He would protect her, care for her, and offer her the safety he could. And in doing so, he found himself changed in ways he hadn't expected. Solitude no longer seemed enough. Life, he realized, was meant to be shared, even if only with one other person who had been through as much as he had. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Jed and Nokomis grew stronger. She became a part of his daily life, and he became a part of hers. They worked side by side, shared stories in the quiet evenings, and faced the challenges of frontier life together. Jed knew that the world beyond their homestead was unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but here, in this small corner of the plains, they had found something rare: trust, companionship, and the fragile beginnings of family. And so, under the endless sky of the western plains, Jed and Nokomis continued their days, unaware that the past was not done with them yet, and that the bonds they were forging would soon be tested in ways neither could imagine. For now, though, they had each other, and in the wilderness of the frontier, that was enough to keep hope alive. The days passed quietly on Jed's homestead, but there was a rhythm now, different from the silence that had once filled the cabin. Nokomis had grown more comfortable in her surroundings, though she remained cautious and observant. She no longer flinched at every sudden sound, and she even began to speak a few words of her own, though carefully and slowly. Jed noticed it with a quiet smile, the small signs of trust warming him in ways he hadn't felt in years. Jed had always been a man of few words. He preferred the steady work of his hands and the open sky to the chatter of townsfolk, but with Nokomis, he found himself talking more than he ever had. He shared stories of his life before the homestead, of the lonely trails he had ridden, of the towns he had visited, and even of the small adventures he had experienced. Nokomis listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity, and her small hands sometimes fidgeting with the hem of her tunic. Jed found her questions simple but thoughtful, and he began to enjoy explaining things, teaching her about the land, the animals, and the ways of survival on the frontier. Despite the bond growing between them, Nokomis remained quiet about her past. Jed had long ago learned not to push her, respecting the walls she had built around herself. He sensed that whatever had happened to her was heavy and painful, and he didn't want to force her to relive it. But there were moments when he saw glimpses of it. Her eyes clouded with fear when a bird's cry sounded too sharp, or when the wind blew in a certain way that seemed to carry memories she could not share. Jed simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and continued with their work, silently telling her that she was safe. One morning, as the sun rose and painted the plains with soft pinks and oranges, Jed and Nokomis set out to check the traps he had set along the river. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and wild grasses. Nokomis walked beside him, her small hands gripping a basket, ready to collect whatever they might find. As they moved along the trail, Jed spoke softly about the tracks in the dirt and how to read them. "See these marks here?" he said, pointing to a series of small indentations. "These are from a rabbit. We can use them to know which way it went." Nokomis nodded, crouching down to study the marks carefully, her dark eyes sharp with interest. It was in moments like these that Jed realized just how clever she was. She absorbed everything, learning quickly and asking questions that sometimes even he had to think about. Her mind worked like a careful map, noting details he might overlook, remembering patterns, and connecting them in ways that surprised him. He began to respect her not only as a child under his care, but as someone with a sharp mind and a strong spirit. Life on the homestead had become predictable in a comforting way. They worked together, shared meals, and spent evenings by the fire. Jed noticed that Nokomis had a natural curiosity and a quiet sense of humor. Occasionally, she would let out a small laugh when he told her a story, a soft sound that felt like music in the otherwise still cabin. He caught himself laughing more often, too, enjoying her company in ways he hadn't realized he had missed. Yet beneath this calm, Jed felt the faint stirring of unease. The plains were wide and beautiful, but they were also unforgiving, and he knew that danger could appear without warning. Stories of Apache tribes, of conflicts, and of settlers lost in the wilderness were never far from his mind. Jed had fought in skirmishes before, and though he had tried to leave that life behind, he could not forget the past entirely. He kept a careful eye on the horizon, on the trails leading to the cabin, and on the forested areas near the river. He wanted to protect Nokomis, and he knew that vigilance was part of that responsibility. As spring approached, the land began to change. Wildflowers sprouted among the tall grasses, birds returned in greater numbers, and the rivers swelled with melting snow from distant mountains. Nokomis delighted in these changes, pointing out colors and sounds that Jed had long taken for granted. He watched her with admiration as she ran lightly along the trail, her laughter ringing across the plains. Yet even in these happy moments he sensed a shadow in her eyes, a memory of loss, of fear, of something she was not ready to share. Jed's concern grew when he noticed a stranger riding slowly near the edge of his property one afternoon. The man did not approach directly but kept his distance, watching from behind a small hill. Jed's instincts told him that the plains were no longer as safe as they had seemed. He watched carefully, noting the man's movements, the way he shifted in the saddle, the way his eyes scanned the cabin. Jed knew that some people on the frontier could be dangerous, and he felt a protective surge for Nokomis. He decided to prepare quietly, without alarming her. He checked the fences, made sure the locks on the cabin doors were secure, and placed a few traps near the edges of the property, not to harm anyone, but to give him an early warning if someone came too close. He also taught Nokomis some basic precautions, how to listen for footsteps in the grass, how to notice shadows, and how to stay quiet when necessary. She learned quickly, her small hands steady, her face serious. Jed could see that she understood the dangers of the world, even if she had not yet experienced them fully. One evening, as they sat outside after supper, Nokomis finally spoke about her past in a small, careful way. She told Jed about her family, though not the full truth, carefully avoiding the mention of her tribe. I had a home once, she said softly, staring into the fire. I had people who cared for me. Her voice trembled slightly, and Jed reached out to place a gentle hand on hers. I know you did, he said quietly, and I'll do my best to make sure you feel safe again. Nokomis nodded, a small glimmer of trust in her eyes. Jed realized that building this trust was delicate work. She had survived horrors he could only imagine, and every gesture of care, every word of kindness, was a brick in the fragile structure of safety he was trying to create around her. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them strengthened. Nokomis helped Jed more confidently around the homestead, fetching water, collecting firewood, and tending the small garden he had started. She asked questions about planting and harvesting, about the seasons and the weather. Jed answered patiently, teaching her not only the practical skills but also the deeper lessons of patience and resilience. He noticed that she had a natural understanding of the land, a kind of intuition that reminded him of the people who had lived here long before settlers arrived. Jed also began to notice changes in himself. He found himself looking forward to Nokomis's company, feeling a sense of responsibility and care that went beyond mere survival. He wanted her to grow strong, to feel safe, and to find happiness again. He realized that the homestead, which had once been a place of solitude and reflection, had become a place of connection, of shared life and mutual support. One morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the plains in soft gold, Jed and Nokomis were gathering eggs from the chickens when they heard the distant sound of hooves. Jed stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. Nokomis froze beside him, her eyes wide. Jed motioned for her to stay calm, whispering, "Stay close, don't make a sound." A small group of travelers appeared, riding slowly along the trail. Jed studied them carefully. They seemed harmless, simple traders on the move, not the dangerous strangers he had feared. He relaxed slightly, though he remained alert. Nokomis watched him closely, sensing his careful judgment, and for a moment she seemed to understand that the world outside could be unpredictable, but that she had someone looking out for her. As the travelers passed, Jed and Nokomis continued their work, though the encounter left a quiet tension in the air. Jed knew that the frontier was a place of uncertainty, that threats could appear suddenly and without warning, but he also knew that this was the world they lived in, and that resilience, caution, and trust in one another were their strongest tools. Evenings continued to be a time of quiet reflection. Jed and Nokomis would sit by the fire, talking softly or simply enjoying the warmth and light. Nokomis began to share more stories about herself, fragments of her past that revealed her courage, her resourcefulness, and her intelligence. Jed listened with admiration and patience, careful not to push too far, but grateful for the small windows into her life. Through these shared moments, Jed realized that Nokomis had taught him as much as he had taught her. She had shown him patience, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving hardship. She had reminded him of the importance of care, of building trust, and of finding connection, even in a harsh and unforgiving world. The homestead thrived quietly under their care. The garden grew, the animals were healthy, and the small routines of daily life became a source of comfort. Jed and Nokomis had created a small world of safety and trust, a fragile but growing bond that gave them both hope. And yet, Jed could not shake the feeling that the past, which they had both tried to leave behind, was not entirely gone. He sensed that sooner or later the truth of Nokomis's identity might come to light, and when it did, their bond, their safety, and their lives could be challenged in ways they were not yet prepared for. For now, though, they lived in the moment, finding joy in small victories and quiet companionship. Jed taught Nokomis the skills she needed to survive, and she taught him the value of trust, laughter, and hope. Together they faced the challenges of the frontier, building a bond that was strong though fragile, and preparing unknowingly for the greater trials that lay ahead. And as the plains stretched endlessly before them, bathed in sunlight or shadowed by night, Jed and Nokomis continued their lives side by side, discovering that even in a world full of uncertainty, connection and care could create a small, enduring sanctuary. Spring had fully arrived on the plains, bringing longer days and the soft, sweet scent of wildflowers in the wind. Jed and Nokomis had grown even closer over the past months. Their small routines, the morning chores, tending the garden, checking traps by the river, and sharing quiet evenings by the fire, had become familiar and comforting. Yet Jed felt a quiet tension he could not ignore. There was an unease in the air, a feeling that something was approaching, though he could not yet see it. One afternoon, Jed was repairing a section of the wooden fence that bordered the property, and Nokomis helped him by holding the boards steady. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the land, and for a moment, all seemed calm. Nokomis hummed softly as she worked, a sound that had become normal on the homestead and which Jed found reassuring. But then a distant sound carried across the plains, a soft rhythmic beat that was unlike the usual noises of birds or animals. Jed froze. He motioned for Nokomis to stop and to be quiet. "Listen," he whispered. Nokomis tilted her head, her dark eyes narrowing as she focused. The sound grew louder, and Jed's heart sank when he recognized it, the steady rhythm of horses' hooves. Not the kind of travel they had seen from passing traders, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. Jed's mind raced. He had long feared this day might come. By the time the riders crested the small hill near the river, Jed could see that it was a band of men and women, and the sight of them made his chest tighten. They rode with precision and discipline, their faces serious and their movements deliberate. Jed's first instinct was to protect Nokomis, to pull her close and hide her. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the approaching group. The leader of the group stopped his horse a few yards from Jed. He was a tall man dressed in traditional clothing, with a strong, commanding presence. His eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on Nokomis. Jed's stomach dropped as he realized the truth he had not anticipated. These were not travelers, not traders. They were her people. Nokomis stiffened beside him, fear flashing in her eyes. Jed understood immediately that she had not spoken of her past to shield herself, but now the past had arrived. The leader dismounted slowly, his gaze unwavering. Jed stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "I mean no trouble," Jed said quietly. "She's safe here. I've done nothing but care for her." The leader's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the tension remained. He spoke in a calm, measured tone. "She is my daughter." The words hit Jed like a hammer. Nokomis's eyes widened, and she took a small step backward, as if pulled by invisible threads of loyalty and fear. Jed's mind raced. The weight of his past came crashing down upon him. Years ago he had been involved in raids against the tribe, though he had tried to leave that life behind. He had caused pain and loss, though he had thought it far away and finished. And now, unknowingly, he had taken in the chief's daughter, the very girl he had wronged before. Guilt and fear swelled in his chest. Nokomis finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Father," she said, looking at the leader. Jed realized that this man was indeed the chief, her father, and that the child he had grown to care for was part of a family with deep history, traditions, and pain. The chief's gaze softened, but there was an unmistakable weight of sorrow in his eyes. He had lost his daughter, had mourned her absence, and now she was before him, unharmed, yet far from home. Jed lowered his head in shame. I did not know," he stammered. I thought she was abandoned. I wanted only to keep her safe. I never would have." His words faltered, unable to fully convey the depth of his remorse. The chief studied him for a long moment. There was anger, certainly, and a deep, simmering pain. But there was also something else, an understanding of the child's safety. Nokomis looked between Jed and her father, her heart torn. She had grown attached to Jed, the man who had protected her, and shown her kindness when she had known little but fear and loss. And now, the man who had cared for her was the same one whose past actions had brought pain to her people. The chief spoke again, his voice steady but heavy with emotion.
"You have kept her safe. That is true.
But do you understand what you have done in the past? The harm you caused my people? The lives you affected?" Jed nodded solemnly, his eyes on the ground. "I do," he said quietly. "And I am sorry. I cannot undo the past, but I will do everything I can to make this right. I will protect her, and I will help your people however I can." Nokomis stepped forward. placing a small hand on Jed's arm. Her dark eyes searched his face. "He helped me," she said softly. "Cared for me. I trust him." Her words were simple but powerful, bridging the gap between the pain of the past and the possibilities of the present. The chief's eyes met hers, and for a moment the air was filled with unspoken understanding. Jed turned to the chief. "If there is anything I can do, anything to make amends, to help you and your people, I will do it, I promise." The chief studied him silently, weighing the sincerity in his voice and the care he had shown Nokomis over the months. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then you will help us," he said. "But you must understand that this is not just about words. Actions will prove your sincerity." He knew that forgiveness was earned through effort, through deeds, not just promises, and he understood that this was his chance to make things right, not just for Nokomis, but for the people he had wronged in the past. Over the next days, Jed worked alongside the chief and his people, helping to repair what had been damaged, assisting in rebuilding shelters, gathering supplies, and sharing knowledge of the land and resources. Nokomis stayed close to her father but also continued to spend time with Jed, her bond with him remaining strong despite the revelations. She had found a new sense of belonging, both with her people and with the man who had become a protector and mentor. Jed learned much from the tribe, too. He listened to their stories, their traditions, their history, and their struggles. He saw the strength and resilience of a people who had endured hardship, yet maintained their dignity and culture. And through it all, he worked humbly, understanding that true restitution required respect, effort, and patience. Nokomis began to share parts of her story with Jed in small ways, describing the village she had grown up in, the games she had played, and the lessons her father had taught her. Jed listened with care, feeling both the sorrow of the past and the hope of the present. He understood that Nokomis's life had been shaped by events beyond her control, but that she had survived with courage and intelligence. As the days turned into weeks, the chief observed Jed closely. He saw the care he showed Nokomis, the effort he made to help the tribe, and the humility with which he approached the work. Slowly, trust began to grow, though it was careful and measured. The chief knew that true forgiveness would take time, but he also recognized that Jed's actions were sincere, and that the bond between Nokomis and Jed was genuine. One evening, as the sun set and the plains were bathed in a golden glow, the chief and Jed stood together, overlooking the river. "You have done well," the chief said quietly. "Not many would take responsibility so fully. Not many would show such care for my daughter." Jed nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "I am learning," he said softly. "I can never undo the past, but I can try to do better." Nokomis watched from a short distance, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief, pride, and love. She had found a way to honor both her father and Jed, bridging the gap between the past and the present. And in that moment, she realized that while life had been cruel and unpredictable, it had also brought her people together in unexpected ways. Jed continued to work tirelessly alongside the tribe, repairing, rebuilding, and aiding wherever he could. Nokomis stayed close to both her father and Jed, learning from both, growing stronger, wiser, and more confident. The bond between them was tested, reshaped by truth and history, yet it endured, and Jed understood, more than ever, that responsibility, care, and genuine effort were the paths to redemption. As the first light of dawn broke over the plains, Jed, Nokomis, and the chief stood together, looking out at the land. The future was uncertain. The past could never be changed, but in that moment, they had found a fragile peace, a new understanding, and the beginnings of reconciliation. And for Jed, who had once walked the plains in solitude, the presence of Nokomis and the trust of her people was a gift beyond measure, a chance to make right what had once gone wrong, and to prove that even in a world filled with mistakes and pain, courage, kindness, and loyalty could endure. Spring had given way to summer on the plains, and the land was alive with color and sound. The river sparkled in the sunlight, wildflowers swayed in the gentle wind, and the hum of insects filled the warm air. For Jed, Nokomis, and the chief, life had shifted into a new rhythm, one built on trust, care, and the slow mending of old wounds. Jed had spent weeks working alongside the tribe, helping rebuild homes, mend fences, and restore the lands that had suffered from past conflicts. His hands were calloused from labor, his skin tanned by the sun, but he worked without complaint. Every effort felt like a step toward redemption. Nokomis moved confidently among her people now, her small frame carrying an air of quiet authority. She listened attentively to her father, learning the skills of leadership, patience, and responsibility. And yet, she remained close to Jed, visiting him often, seeking guidance, or simply sharing a quiet moment by the river. Their bond had deepened in ways that words could not fully capture. She trusted him, not only as a protector, but as a friend, a teacher, and someone who had shown her kindness when the world had been cruel. Jed found himself reflecting on the past with a heavier heart. He could not forget the pain he had caused the tribe, the lives affected by his actions, and the mistakes he had made before ever meeting Nokomis. And yet, he also recognized that the present offered a chance to make amends, to turn guilt into meaningful action, and to build something lasting. Each day of labor, each moment of care, each conversation he shared with the chief and the tribe was an opportunity to prove himself worthy of their trust. The chief, for his part, observed Jed carefully. He had seen the man's sincerity and effort, but he also understood that true forgiveness was not immediate. It came slowly, through actions and time, through consistency and respect. The chief watched as Jed worked tirelessly alongside the tribe, helping repair structures, sharing knowledge of the land, and demonstrating humility. Slowly he began to allow himself to trust the man, not blindly, but with cautious hope. One morning, the chief gathered the tribe for a small council by the river. Jed was asked to join, along with Nokomis, who stood proudly beside her father. The chief's voice carried across the water as he spoke to his people about the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and cooperation. He acknowledged the past hardships caused by outsiders and explained that Jed had proven himself through actions, not words alone. Actions, he said firmly, are what show the heart. Jed has worked with us, helped us, and protected Nokomis. That is why he stands here today, not as a stranger, but as a friend. The words were met with quiet murmurs of approval from the tribe. Jed bowed his head respectfully, feeling the weight of both gratitude and humility. He knew that trust had been earned, but he also understood that it must continue to be nurtured. Nokomis, standing beside her father, felt a surge of pride and relief. She had feared the past would destroy the bond she had formed with Jed, that the truth of her identity would tear apart the life she had begun to build. But seeing the chief's acceptance, hearing his words, and witnessing the tribe's cautious approval, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in months. She glanced at Jed, her dark eyes softening, and offered him a small smile, one that spoke volumes about their shared journey. In the days that followed, Jed continued his work with renewed purpose. He assisted the tribe in gathering food, repairing homes, and tending to the lands along the river. Nokomis joined him whenever she could, learning new skills and helping others. Together they demonstrated a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and care. The tribe, once wary, began to see Jed not as a threat, but as someone who had chosen to act with integrity, even in the face of a painful history. Jed also took time to teach Nokomis about life beyond the tribe's lands, sharing lessons about survival, the seasons, and the animals that roam the plains. She listened attentively, absorbing his knowledge, while sharing her own insights about the land and her people. Their exchanges became a source of joy for both, a balance between learning and teaching, between past and present, between caution and trust. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains, a small celebration took place in the village. The chief had called it a gathering to honor the progress they had made together, to recognize the cooperation that had grown between Jed and the tribe. Families and friends assembled, laughter and music filling the air. Nokomis wore a simple dress adorned with bright patterns, her hair neatly braided. She moved among the people confidently, her presence a symbol of resilience and hope. Jed, standing nearby, observed the scene quietly. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, but also a lingering awareness that this peace had been hard-won. He remembered the mistakes of his past, the pain he had caused, and the uncertainty of the days when he first brought Nokomis to his homestead. And yet, looking at the tribe, seeing their smiles, their acceptance, and the bond he had helped nurture, he realized that redemption was possible, that mistakes could be acknowledged and corrected through care, effort, and integrity. During the celebration, Nokomis approached Jed, offering him a small woven basket filled with berries she had gathered. "For you?" she said softly. "Thank you for helping me." Jed accepted it with a nod, feeling a warmth spread through him. "You've helped me too," he replied.
"More than you know." Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they acknowledged the journey they had shared, the trust, the challenges, the lessons, and the growth. As night fell, the plains were bathed in the soft glow of the moon.
Jed, Nokomis, and the chief stood by the river, the water reflecting the silver light. The chief spoke quietly, his tone both solemn and gentle. "The past cannot be undone," he said, "but the future is ours to shape. Jed, you have chosen to do right, and that matters more than words. Nokomis is safe, and our people have hope. That is your gift to us." Jed bowed his head, humbled by the chief's words. He had come to the plains seeking solitude and survival, but he had found something far greater, the chance to repair what had been broken and to help nurture life, trust, and family. Nokomis leaned against Jed, her small hand resting on his arm. She felt a sense of belonging that she had not known for months. She was with her people, with her father, yet she also had the connection she had forged with Jed, a bond built on care, trust, and shared experience. She realized that life could be complicated, that love and loyalty could take many forms, and that forgiveness, though difficult, could create a future filled with possibility. In the weeks that followed, Jed and the tribe continued their work together. Homes were repaired, crops tended, and the land restored. Jed found a place among the people, not as an outsider, but as someone who had chosen to act with integrity and respect. Nokomis thrived, learning from both her father and Jed, growing stronger, wiser, and more confident with each passing day. Jed also learned to find peace within himself. The weight of his past actions had been heavy, but through his efforts and the acceptance of the tribe, he discovered that it was possible to make amends, to earn trust, and to contribute meaningfully to the world. He realized that redemption was not a single moment, but a journey, one built on care, effort, and humility. As summer reached its peak, the plains were alive with color and life. Jed, Nokomis, and the chief stood together, watching the river flow and the sun set in a blaze of gold and orange. The past had been difficult, full of mistakes, loss, and pain. But in the present, they had found connection, trust, and hope. And as they stood together, Jed understood that the choices he had made, though imperfect, had led to this moment, a moment of reconciliation, growth, and the promise of a brighter future. Jed felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his efforts had made a difference. He had come to the plains seeking a simple life, yet he had found something far richer, the ability to repair what had been broken, to protect those who mattered, and to build bonds that could endure. Nokomis, standing proudly beside him and her father, embodied the strength, resilience, and hope that had guided them through the challenges of the past. The plains stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the fading light of the setting sun. Jed, Nokomis, and the chief had faced the shadows of the past, confronted the mistakes of history, and emerged stronger for it. The future was still uncertain, as it always would be on the frontier, but they faced it together, with courage, trust, and the knowledge that even in a world full of challenges, kindness, care, and integrity could create lasting bonds. And so life continued on the plains, a story of redemption, forgiveness, and hope. Jed had learned that even the hardest mistakes could be faced with courage, that trust could be rebuilt through care and effort, and that bonds formed in adversity. Nokomis had discovered her strength, her resilience, and her ability to trust again, finding both family and friendship in unexpected ways. And the chief, who had once mourned the loss of his daughter, now saw her safe, thriving, and surrounded by people who cared for her. Under the vast, endless sky of the western plains, Jed walked beside Nokomis and the chief, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly with each step. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying the promise of new days, new challenges, and new opportunities. And in that quiet, enduring moment, they all knew that even in a world full of uncertainty, they had found something rare and precious: peace, connection, and the chance to build a future together.